You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk, your local community radio run by volunteers. Log on to our website at dialectradio.co.uk to find out more.
My name's David Drew. I'm 70 next birthday, and I did my medical training at the medical school in Bristol, at the university, and after qualifying I did some postgraduate work in Bristol and then in Birmingham, and then in 1977 I went off with an American mission organisation to run refugee camp services in northern Thailand at the end of the Indochina War. After I came back from that, I went to tropical medical school, did some more studies, and then went off for 5 years to central belt of Nigeria, working as a paediatrician in a university hospital. Well, when I came back, I did a few years of locums to get as a consultant in the NHS to get back into the system, and eventually ended up with a permanent consultant post at Walsall Manor Hospital in the Black Country in the West Midlands.
Now, can you give us an idea of how getting qualified as a doctor has changed over the years? We've heard quite a lot about the junior doctors recently and potential attempts to change their contracts, having things imposed on them. But as someone that's been in the profession for a long time, how can you tell us how the basic training has changed?
Well, actually, I don't think, apart from the fact that there have been huge strides in medical knowledge since I went to medical school, I don't think the training has changed as much as you might think. In fact, two of my own children went through medical school and qualified about 8 or 9 years ago. The actual undergraduate medical training, there's obviously competition for space for subjects all the time, and people are trying to get patient safety and whistleblowing and things like that on the curriculum, but there often isn't space.
And what about the big leaps forward in knowledge? Because that's also another thing which it helps put today's medicine in perspective from when you were doing your training.
Oh yeah, well, when I was training, although there were some specialisms in my own field of paediatrics, there were sort of paediatric cardiologists, for example, but in Bristol at the Children's Hospital, there was only one paediatric cardiologist and 2 surgeons. But for most other things, there was very, very little development of specialty paediatrics. So I grew up and came through medical school knowing when I did actually realise I wanted to be a paediatrician, knowing that I was likely to be a generalist. And in fact, that's what I ended up doing because I love general paediatrics. But in those days, there wasn't the development of subspecialties.
So what sort of complaints in children do paediatricians have to deal with? Just give us an idea of a spread of the sort of things that you get on your plate. Okay,
well, the 2 sort of big things are respiratory infections and gastrointestinal infections, like pneumonias, bronchitis, asthma, gastroenteritis, winter vomiting bugs, all that sort of thing. So they're the sort of things which a lot of children don't come to hospital with, but when they become very ill with those conditions, they end up in hospital, and probably those conditions still account for, I would imagine, half of all the admissions. So that's that. But then after that, it's just a huge number of different kinds of conditions. In fact, it's 6 years since I've practiced now. I've spent my last 6 years doing other things, and it's all beginning to get a little bit vague.
Well, fair enough, because the reason you're not practicing still is partly because you were sacked. Can you just tell us why and how? Because it was quite an extraordinary case, wasn't it?
It was. was an extraordinary case, and but it's also not atypical of what happens in NHS hospitals when even quite senior, very senior doctors get into conflict with senior management over patient care. So, I'd been qualified for almost 40 years, and I was only about 2 or 3 years away from retirement when things started to go wrong in my hospital. I'd been head of the department for 7 years, and the hospital was starting to make cuts so that it could pay the mortgage for a new private finance initiative hospital. And it was also trying to get the money together, the money right, so that we could become a foundation trust. And that meant cuts right through the hospital. And this impacted very badly on patient safety, because about 70% of the whole running budget for a hospital is on salaries. And the main people who are salaried in a hospital are in a paediatric department are the nurses and the doctors, and so they started to make a very significant part of the nurse workforce redundant, and even started trying to make redundancies amongst the medical staff. And in fact, the BMA told me at that time that we were the only hospital in the country where medical staff were being made redundant. Anyway, so I had to, as somebody who knew the department better than anybody else, and somebody who'd been a leader for the previous 7 years, it was my job to register concerns about that with the senior managers, and that's what I did. And that was the sort of thing that started to get me embroiled in conflict with them. And rather than be reasonable and deal with it properly, they had their own ways of dealing with it.
So are you talking about some kind of bullying? I mean, that often happens in big business and finance, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Even sometimes in something as basic as working in a shop. But you would have hoped that wouldn't be going on in the National Health Service.
Oh, well, as an organisation, the bullying is it's more prevalent in the NHS than anywhere else, probably, than in any industry. And in fact, Sir Ian Kennedy, who ran the Bristol Hearts inquiry in the late 90s, one of the last things that he did when he was the health improvement boss, he gave an interview to a medical journal saying that the biggest problem that the NHS was facing, and this was in 2008, was bullying. And in fact, on the staff survey, which is published every year, about 25% of the workforce report that they have experienced bullying. And it's a top-down thing. It comes right from the top. It comes from outside the trusts. The chief executives, about 80% of them say that they are pressurized and bullied to meet targets, and whether they're clinical targets, waiting times, financial targets. And that, of course, is almost certainly getting worse at the present time. So yeah, bullying is a big thing in the NHS.
So what happened to you?
What happened to me was that, again, it's all getting a bit hazy now, but I suppose there came a point when I felt that I had to put it all down on paper for the chief executive and the chairman of that trust. I did that. They organised a meeting with the BMA, and they said that they would get the Royal College of Paediatrics to send a team in to look at the situation and to adjudicate. Well, it was just a very strange time, because the college sent 3 people in who, although they did some kind of an investigation and produced some kind of a report, the trust locked that report up and refused to let anybody except me see it. And they then went into some kind of a lockdown mode, and asked everybody who had been investigated by this college team, that included me, to sign off on all of the requirements. They didn't call them recommendations. These were things which we had to do, and it turned out that if you didn't agree to them, then you would be sacked. So one of the things that I did was that I showed this report, or a very small part of it, to the heads of the other departments in the hospital. And so that gained me. I was officially sacked for gross misconduct and insubordination. And I was said to have been insubordinate to the senior managers by letting the clinical directors of the other departments in the hospital see portions of this report, which they'd asked to see, and which the chief executive had promised that they would be allowed to see. But to this day, that report has never been made public. But in fact now, as a result of the inquiry into the scandal up at Morecambe Bay, there is a requirement that any trust that gets a Royal College in to do one of those kind of investigations, they have to publish the whole report online. And that's what should have happened at the time. I think if that had happened, I would have. I don't think I would have ended up being sacked. But like so many other things, these are very, very complicated things. All I know now, looking back 6 years on, is that patients were being put at risk by cuts, and it was my job to register objections about that, and that put me into conflict with them. And at some point, the BMA told me, David, they will sack you, and there's very little that we can do about it. And they were right. A year later, I was out.
It seems a pity, since you've got all this expertise, that you're not there actually able to do your job for us who pay your wages, the public, the taxpayer. A great pity. And what do you put this kind of logic behind this kind of management strategy?
Well, look, Sir Robert Francis investigated all this in 2014 and published a report in February of 2015 called the Freedom to Speak Up Report. And that whole investigation that Francis did was commissioned as a result of me going to see Simon Stevens, who's the boss of the NHS, and Jeremy Hunt, with 5 other whistleblowers. And in fact, Francis he did a huge, he did a good job in many ways, although he did really let us down. But I'll just tell you what Jeremy Hunt said on the day that told the House of Commons on the day that the report was published. And he just said, Robert Francis has told me about people whose horrific stories of people's lives being destroyed, losing their jobs, being financially ruined, being brought to the brink of suicide with family lives shattered because they tried to do the right thing for their patients. Eminent and respected clinicians had their reputations maligned. There are stories of fear, bullying, ostracization, etc., psychological and physical harm. Well, I mean, the point is that I wasn't on my own. There were dozens and dozens of us who lost our jobs, and some of them, in fact, I was a bit lucky because I was only 2 or 3 years away from retirement. I couldn't work again. I was blacklisted and never got back into the NHS again. But I coped with it because I've got a very supportive and helpful family, and I've got a very happy life. But the people who were younger, they've had a dreadful time, and like many of them found themselves blacklisted and have never been able to work again. And although 2 years ago Jeremy Hunt promised that there would be some way of preventing this blacklisting and getting these people back to work, not one of them has been allowed to go back to work. So some of them have gone off to other countries. Some of them have taken other jobs up. Some of them gone into the private sector. But they were all, and I know many of them, they were all excellent professionals, and they are a loss to the NHS. And they were lost to the NHS because the senior managers could not cope with their ethical approach to patient care, and with the fact that when they saw something going wrong, they had to speak about it.
Amazing. Well, I mean, I'm quite shocked to hear, David, that there is such a thing as a blacklist. I mean, I would have thought that kind of thing is illegal. It's basically where names are added to a list, a blacklist, when employees or anybody really starts to speak out against, basically blowing the whistle on safety matters. It's as far as I know, it's actually illegal to stop someone working because they are bringing up safety issues. Now, that actually is a positive thing that any really decent manager should embrace.
Well, of course, now you've got people like Jeremy Hunt and all of them. Even the people who said there was no problem, like Sir David Nicholson, the previous head of the NHS, who said there was no problem with whistleblowing in the NHS. Even he now is, I've always helped whistleblowers when I've come across them. And, whistleblowers are to be treasured, and whistleblowers are giving us the kind of information which we need to improve our services and all that kind of nonsense. So, but as far as the blacklisting is concerned, I'm not much of an expert of it because although I was told you'll never work again, and I've got that on a transcript from the trust lawyer, it didn't bother me too much, and so I never really thought of myself as blacklisting because I've always got plenty to do. But the people, Jeremy Hunt acknowledged when Francis published that people were being blacklisted and that he would bring in legislation. And I know that he did do some kind of legislation to help people. But the fact is that there are people who still cannot get a job in the NHS. And in fact, NHS England has now got a scheme to get blacklisted people who were whistleblowers back into the workplace. But almost 2 years after Francis published, there isn't one person who has been brought back into the workplace. So it all sounds a bit hollow, really.
Well, another thing is that we've had this again this week, a woman called Sarah Kuti, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it.
Oh, yeah.
But she's been fired for offering to pray for a patient. Now, I mean, surely in a world which is multicultural, we're supposed to be into things like equalities, that all different views, whether they're religious or non-religious, should be acceptable. And yet it seems that there is actually, and I know you're part of this as well, some sort of targeting of people for their faith.
Oh, yeah. Well, in my own case, once they decide to get rid of me, and I've got the documents with the evidence, and it's all in my book as well, they did a trawl trying to, and this is what they do, they try to, they go through people's expenses, they look at any cases that you've had that have gone wrong. But in my case, one of the managers found that ages earlier I'd sent this little prayer called, everybody knows it, the one that goes, to give and not to count the cost, and it's a sort of rallying call for we do our job because of the joy we get out of it, rather than because we're going to get a big reward at the end of it. And I was in a very multicultural department. I sent it to everybody. I got emails back saying, that's fantastic. I'm a Muslim, but I like it. I'm an atheist. I like it. I'm going to have that on my bedroom wall. And not a single person said anything other than positive about it. But the manager sort of wrote to somebody else in senior management and said, this is inappropriate, that he should be doing this sort of thing. Months after it happened, of course. So that became a major, major issue. And in all the national press, and in fact on the second day of my Employment Tribunal, Rupert Murdoch got hold of the story, and it was in the media in 80 countries the next day. The doctor fined for a prayer. So anyway, but for me that was just, I am a Christian, but I wasn't asking anybody to pray a prayer. I wasn't trying to convert anybody. I was just trying to encourage people with this sort of idea that, we're here because we love being here, not because, we're going to be very rich and all the rest of it. It was at a time when we were negotiating salaries in the department, so that was the background to it. Yeah, that's a very complicated case, I think, and it'll all come out in the tribunal. But it's only last week that our Prime Minister was saying, people ought to talk about their Christian faith in the workplace a bit more than they do. But, of course, when people do, then they start to get this kind of nonsense. And the thing is that the managers that I dealt with over the prayer, seriously, they were so ignorant about faith, religion, philosophy, that's anything like that you try to talk to them about. No, it's inappropriate. You shouldn't be doing this.
Astonishing story, David. What's the title of your book?
Okay, the book is called Little Stories of Life and Death at NHS Whistleblower. That is my Twitter account.
Amazing. And I wonder if we could finish, if you could just read us the poem which played a part in actually getting you sacked as a brilliant doctor from the health service.
Yeah, okay. So it's the prayer of St. Ignatius Loyola, who was he was a warrior priest, a soldier priest, really, and he was the founder of the Jesuits. He was the person who led the Counter-Reformation against the Protestant Reformation in Europe. And his prayer goes something like this. It says, "Dear Lord, help us to serve you as you deserve, to give and not to count the cost, to fight and not to heed the wounds, to toil and not to seek for rest, to labour and not to ask for any reward other than doing your will." And that was it. But they would not let that go.
Sounds like a very fantastic sentiment and a nice way.
Well, I mean, the thing is, so many people have said to me since then, we had that. Everybody had to learn that off by heart at our prep school or something like that. Well, I didn't go to prep school, of course. I just went to an ordinary state school. But we had it, and in those days, of course, when I think Christian faith had a more prominent place in school. Of course, society's changed hugely now. Everybody would have known it, and also, even if you don't actually believe in God, it's just a remarkably wonderful sentiment of service.
Do you think that we're drifting away from the truth in Britain? Because one of the, I can remember when I was certainly going to school, in infant school and junior school, faith was very much an important part of the way we were brought up, and it seems strange that we're now in a situation where if you express your faith at work, you could be sacked for it.
Isn't that amazing? That sort of thing is happening, and the sackings are only the tip of the iceberg, because underneath it there is a general anti-religious sentiment. Now, I am a Christian. I don't think of myself as being particularly religious. I've got a very, very strong faith. But, and I am slightly conflicted in that I am a sort of well-educated modern Christian, and I do not take the whole Bible literally, as some people do. But that's one of the reasons. And they've said religion is going to sort of disappear. But if you watch the news, there's more about religion on the news and on the telly and on the radio and in the press these days, and a lot of it because of the challenge of Islam. And different ideas about, what a Muslim is and all the rest of it. And that is challenging people's thinking about it. I don't want to be a Christian just to say, thank God I'm not a Muslim or something like that. I'm a Christian because I'm a Christian because when I was at Bristol University, having had a sort of nominal Christian upbringing, I encountered people who were really, really strong, committed Christians, and got to know them and learned all about it, and that was it. Yeah.
What about in your work? Have you come across any sort of real power of faith in healing people?
Well, I have slight difficulty with the sort of whole thing about, instantaneous divine healing and all the rest of it. I believe God can do anything, but I haven't personally seen that happening in a way that I would say, somebody grew a leg that wasn't there before or anything like that. But, yeah, of course, I have seen some of the most remarkable things happen to people. And, on occasion, it wasn't that uncommon, actually, for me to pray with patients at the hospital in the quiet and confidentiality of the outpatient room or something like that.
Oh, give us an example, David. Give us an example. How does this stuff work?
How does it work?
Yeah.
In what way?
And what have you seen that's made you think that faith has played a role in getting someone better?
Oh, well, that's the thing about it. You can't sort of prove it, can you? But the fact is that we are made in a wonderful way, and that you can have a child who is next to death, and you are fairly confident that this is going to turn out very badly, and that child will rally, and then just a few days later be completely recovered. Now, of course, a huge amount of it is down to medical science and doctors and drugs and operations and stuff like that. But my own understanding is that when we pray, that God does hear us and that he does act. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that he doesn't seem to act consistently. And you don't know. Sometimes the answer that you get is seems to be no, something like that. So yeah, this is not very good theology, I'm afraid. It's just my own paediatrician's insights that I've had over many years.
All right. Well, I'm trying to pin you down a bit here, but have you ever seen any kind of transformation in a patient that you personally felt was due to some sort of faith-related influence rather than?
We had a little baby one night, and there was a sister on the neonatal unit, and she rang me and she said, "Can you come down, Dr. Drew?" And I said, "Okay." She said, "Look, this one's going." And the baby was having a lot of premature baby, having a lot of stopping breathing, heart rate dropping, ventilator was right up, and she said, "Are you Christian?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." She said, "Look, what I'm going to do is just going to open the incubator and I'm going to put my hand on this baby's head. Let's pray." And the most amazing thing, I mean, I know that this nurse would remember this absolutely well because we talked about it for years. Everything just became like the heart rate came up, the oxygen levels in the baby's blood came up, and that baby, within a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, I don't remember the details, was off the ventilator and, was into special care and on its way out at that over a relatively short period of time.
Okay, David Drew, thanks very much for joining us on Dialect.
Okay, God bless.
That's all for this week. Dialects Bristol's first weekly MP3 podcast. If you're online, you can subscribe to our emails or download the podcast from dialectradio.co.uk. Thanks to our guests this week, Tim Tim Tiley, who has a little business distributing Christian material to churches, etc., just off Gloucester Road. And to David Drew, you just heard from there, the paediatrician who was sacked from the NHS for doing his job. And also thanks to studio engineer Dave Bazanko. Dialects of Bristol Broadband Co-op production. Catch us on Bristol Community FM 93.2 every Tuesday at noon, and anyone can contribute. Get hold of us through the People's Republic of Stokes Croft, just off Jamaica Street, 0117 909 6897 or prsc.org.uk. Also through Volunteering Bristol. That's one word, volunteerbristol.org.uk. That was Dialect, and I'm Tony Gosling, wishing you a very good week. Thanks for listening. Till the same time next week. Goodbye for now.
Good evening, brothers and sisters. I'm very sorry to announce that Deacon Jones will not be present at the services today. Had a slight accident. But he wants everybody to be happy, because when you're happy, that's what counts.